Alaska, a territory for the physically and mentally strong. Good evening, friends. Tonight, we venture into the frozen darkness of Alaska, where only the strong survive. These terrifying tales will test your nerves. I'd like to know your location and what time you're watching from. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Help me reach 1,000 subscribers and unlock more chilling stories from the last frontier. Welcome to the cold, if you dare. I am a methodical person. I want you to understand that before anything else. I grew up in Boise, Idaho, the son of an electrical engineer and a woman who taught high school mathematics, and between the two of them they instilled in me a relationship with precision that bordered on compulsive. I calibrated things. I verified readings twice, sometimes 3 times, not because I doubted the instruments but because the act of verification was itself satisfying, the confirmation that the world was behaving according to its stated parameters, that numbers meant what they said they meant, that cause reliably produced effect. I had worked in radio communications and atmospheric monitoring for 11 years before I took the Alaska contract. I was 34 years old, unmarried, with a 1-bedroom apartment in Boise and a 10-year-old truck and a savings account that I added to with the consistency of someone who finds comfort in incremental accumulation. I was not a complicated man. I was not a man given to flights of imagination or mystical interpretation or the kind of free-floating anxiety that makes people see patterns and randomness. I need you to understand all of that. Because what I am about to describe will sound like the account of someone unreliable, and I am not unreliable, and the distinction matters more to me than I can adequately express. The contract was 6 months. A remote atmospheric monitoring station operated by a private environmental research firm out of Anchorage, positioned in the interior of Alaska approximately 340 miles north of Fairbanks, which itself sits at the edge of what most Americans would recognize as the inhabitable world. The station's function was atmospheric data collection, temperature, pressure, humidity, particulate levels, various readings that fed into a larger climate research database. My function was to transmit that data via a specific radio frequency every 4 hours, maintain the equipment, and file a daily summary report through a satellite uplink that connected me to the company's server in Anchorage. The recruiter who called me described it as a high-compensation solitude position. I remember that phrase because it was so precisely calibrated to appeal to exactly what I was, a man who liked quiet, who was comfortable with his own company, who found the idea of 6 months of focused, purposeful work in a remote location more appealing than troubling. I said yes within 48 hours. I signed the contract. I drove to the Boise airport on a Sunday morning in January, flew to Anchorage, spent a night in a hotel near the airport, and then flew north on a small charter plane that deposited me, my equipment bags, and 4 months of supply crates at a landing strip that was essentially a flat stretch of cleared ground surrounded by spruce forest. A technician from the previous rotation drove me to the station and spent 2 hours explaining the equipment before getting back in the truck and driving away without what I would describe as an adequate amount of conversation. His name was Vickers. He was perhaps 45, with the interior-worn look of someone who had spent significant time in remote postings and had allowed that time to erode whatever social architecture he'd arrived with. He showed me the radio equipment, the satellite uplink terminal, the atmospheric sensors, the generator, the emergency protocols binder. When I asked him how the rotation had been, he said fine in the way that people say the word when they have decided that the alternative to fine is a conversation they are not prepared to have. He got in the truck. He left. I stood outside the station in the January cold and looked at the landscape, which in every direction was spruce forest and sky and the specific, oppressive quality of Arctic silence that you cannot understand until you are inside it. I had grown up in Idaho. I had spent time in rural areas. I thought I knew what quiet meant. I did not know what quiet meant. The silence of that place was not the absence of sound, it was a presence. dense, directional, aware. I stood in it for perhaps 2 minutes before going inside, and during those 2 minutes I had the distinct and unnerving sensation that the silence was oriented toward me, that it had noticed me arrive. I filed this under adjustment period and went to work. The first 8 weeks were as I had expected them to be. The equipment was well maintained and reliable. The transmission schedule was straightforward: 0200, 0600, 1000, 1400, 1800, 2200, 6 times daily, each transmission consisting of my call sign, the station identifier, and the current atmospheric readings in a specific sequence. The satellite uplink worked. The generator performed. I cooked my meals, read my books, maintained my equipment logs with the thoroughness that the job and my nature both required, and went to bed each night in the particular exhaustion of a man who has filled his day with purposeful work and solitude. I spoke to my sister in Portland once a week via satellite phone. I spoke to my supervisor in Anchorage every 2 weeks. I did not speak to anyone else. This did not bother me. I had anticipated it, even welcomed it. There is a quality to chosen solitude, particularly in a place of such extreme natural severity, that feels, in the early weeks, like clarity. The noise of ordinary life, the accumulated friction of other people's needs and schedules and conversational expectations, falls away, and what remains is something that feels briefly like the essential self, unencumbered. I felt productive. I felt focused. I felt, for the first 8 weeks, entirely at peace with where I was and what I was doing. Then the echo started. It was a Thursday. I remember this because I had a specific weekly log format, and Thursday was the day I completed the equipment calibration checklist, so the date is documented with a precision I could not have anticipated needing. I was running the 1800 transmission, standard procedure, reading the day's final atmospheric summary into the microphone with the flat professional delivery I had developed over 11 years of this kind of work. I finished the transmission, logged the completion time, reached for my coffee, and heard my own voice come back to me from the receiver. Not immediately. With a delay of perhaps 6 seconds. And not the complete transmission, only the last phrase I had spoken, the pressure reading and the station sign off. 14.2 millibars, steady. Station NWA 7, out. Returned to me in my own voice, with my own cadence, in a pitch and timbre I recognized as precisely mine. I checked the equipment. Checked the frequency. Ran a diagnostic on the receiver hardware. Everything nominal. I noted the anomaly in the log with the careful, neutral language that scientific documentation requires: apparent signal reflection or bleed from adjacent frequency, duration approximately 6 seconds, isolated incident, and moved on with my evening. It happened again at 2200. And at 0200. By the end of the following week, it was happening at every transmission, without exception. Always the same structure. My last spoken phrase returned to me after a delay that varied between 4 and 8 seconds. I reported it to my supervisor in Anchorage. He said he'd look into frequency interference from other operations in the region. He did not sound concerned. I was mildly concerned but not alarmed. Atmospheric communication anomalies are not unusual, particularly in the interior of Alaska, where the ionosphere behaves in ways that can produce unusual signal propagation. I had encountered similar phenomena before. I documented each instance and kept transmitting. What changed was the content. In the 9th week, the echo stopped repeating my last phrase. It began repeating a phrase from the middle of each transmission instead. Not always the same phrase, different selections, different positions within the transmission sequence, but always clearly chosen. Specific. I noticed this on a Tuesday at 1000, and I sat at the console for a long time after the transmission ended, listening to the silence of the receiver and I felt something move through me that I did not immediately recognize because I had not felt it in this context before. It took me several minutes to identify it as fear. Not the dramatic, adrenaline-mediated fear of immediate physical threat. The slower, colder fear of a pattern that should not exist. An echo is a reflection. A reflection reproduces the source material. It does not select from the source material. It does not choose. The phenomenon I was now documenting was not a reflection. It was a response. Something, some process, some system, some intelligence operating on a frequency adjacent to or embedded within my transmission channel was listening to my broadcasts and returning selected content. Content that, as I began to review my logs with increasing urgency over the following days, appeared to be thematically consistent. The return phrases were invariably the readings that contained the most significant data, pressure anomalies, temperature deviations, the numbers that carried the most informational weight. It was as if something was telling me which parts of my transmissions mattered. I called Anchorage. My supervisor ran a check on adjacent frequencies in the region. He found nothing operating on any registered frequency within 200 miles of my position. He said the phenomenon was likely an atmospheric artifact, possibly related to solar activity affecting the ionosphere. He said to continue documenting and he escalated to the technical team. He sounded mildly interested in the way that people sound when a problem is theoretically interesting but not their immediate responsibility. I escalated my level of documentation. I began recording every transmission and every returned echo on a secondary device, building an audio archive that I reviewed each evening. I mapped the selections. I built a visual chart of which phrases were being returned and when. I am a methodical person. When confronted with an anomaly, I collect data. It is the only productive response I know to the experience of not understanding something. The chart showed a pattern within 2 weeks. The echoes were not random. They were not thematically selected. They were sequential. The returned phrases, placed in the order in which they were returned, formed a coherent progression, not in language, because they were fragments of atmospheric data, but in numerical structure. The numbers that were being returned, in sequence, constituted a countdown. I stared at this chart for a very long time. In the 11th week, the voice changed. Not dramatically. Not obviously. If I had not been recording every transmission and reviewing the audio with the attention of someone building a case, which, by this point, I essentially was, I might not have noticed it at first. But I had been listening to my own voice through that receiver for 11 weeks, and I knew its qualities the way you know the sound of your own name. The pitch was slightly different. The consonants were slightly different. The breathing pattern was different. The voice returning my phrases was no longer mine. It was close. It was constructed from my voice, built from the material of my transmissions, assembled into something that approximated my vocal characteristics with an accuracy that was deeply, viscerally disturbing in the way that approximations of human things always are more disturbing than either the real thing or a clearly artificial imitation. The uncanny valley is a concept developed in the context of robotics, but standing in that station in the dark, in the terrible silence of the Alaskan interior, listening to something that was almost my voice coming back to me through a receiver that should have been silent, I understood the concept in my body rather than my mind. Something had been listening to me for 11 weeks. Listening carefully enough to learn how I sounded. And now it was speaking. I stopped sleeping well. I want to document this accurately because the sleep deprivation becomes relevant to the question, which I know will be asked, which I have asked myself, of whether my perception of subsequent events was reliable. I was sleeping perhaps 4 hours a night by week 12. Not because of nightmares or acute anxiety, but because of a bone-deep vigilance that I could not turn off. Every time I closed my eyes, I was aware of the receiver on the other side of the wall. Aware of the frequency. aware of the silence that wasn't silence. I left the monitoring equipment running while I slept, and I left the audio recording active, and in the morning I reviewed what had been captured. For 2 weeks, nothing was captured during the overnight hours except static and the occasional atmospheric pop that characterizes high-latitude radio reception. No transmissions, because I was not transmitting between 2200 and 0200. No echoes, because there was nothing to echo. Until the night of the 14th week. I woke at 3:17 a.m. to a sound from the receiver that I cannot describe as anything other than breathing. Slow, deliberate, rhythmic. I went to the console in my long underwear and wool socks and sat down and turned up the gain and listened. It was breathing. Or it was a near-perfect acoustic simulation of breathing, the same slight imprecision as the voice, the same uncanny construction from materials that were almost but not quite the right materials. I sat and listened to it for 4 minutes before it stopped. Then silence. Then, in the voice that was almost mine but not mine, 3 words. You made errors. I did not move for a long time. When I was capable of moving, I went to my logs. I went back through my transmission records for the previous week. I had been meticulous, as I always was. I found 2 errors, minor pressure reading transcriptions, values I had corrected in subsequent transmissions, corrections I had not flagged to Anchorage because they were within the margin of what the reporting protocol classified as self-correctable. I had not reported them to anyone. I had not mentioned them to my supervisor. I had not documented them in any system that was accessible outside this station. Whatever was on the other end of that frequency knew about them anyway. I transmitted an emergency report to Anchorage at 0600. I laid out the complete record, the echo sequence, the voice change, the countdown structure, the overnight transmission, the 3 words, the errors. I transmitted it clearly and thoroughly and with the precise, unemotional language of a professional documenting an anomaly, because that was all I knew how to do. I was methodical. I was a methodical person. I held on to that. The satellite uplink went down at 0800. Not gradually. Not with warning. It went down the way equipment goes down when it is interrupted at the source rather than failing from within, a complete cessation, immediate and total. I ran diagnostics. The uplink hardware showed normal. The satellite acquisition showed normal. The signal simply was not reaching its destination. The channel was open and the signal was going somewhere, but it was not reaching Anchorage. I spent 6 days in a condition I can only describe as a controlled disintegration. The word horror is insufficient for what I was experiencing, and I have tried to find a more accurate word and failed. It was the specific terror of a man who understands exactly what is happening to him and has no mechanism to stop it. The station was functional. The equipment was functional. I was transmitting on schedule because the protocol required it and because performing the protocol was the only structure I had left. But I no longer knew where my transmissions were going. I no longer knew who was receiving them. I no longer knew what was receiving them. At night I sat at the console and listened to the breathing on the frequency and did not respond to it, because responding to it felt like accepting a relationship I was not willing to accept. I documented everything. I maintained my equipment logs with a precision that was by now almost mechanical, a body memory operating independent of a mind that was significantly occupied with fear. The temperature outside was 42 below zero. The nearest town of any size was Fairbanks, 340 miles south, across terrain that would kill me in hours if I attempted it on foot. I was as isolated as a man in my situation could be, which is to say I was completely isolated, which is to say I was alone with whatever was on that frequency in a way that had no civilian equivalent anywhere in the continental United States. On the 6th night, the voice said my full name. Not the name I use professionally. Not the name on the contract. My full name, the name on my birth certificate, the name my mother called me when I was in trouble as a child, the name I had not used since I left Boise and which appeared in no document I had filed with the company in Anchorage. 4 syllables. Precisely articulated. In that voice that was built from my voice but was not my voice, that had learned the shape of my speech patterns over 14 weeks of listening and had constructed from them something that wore my acoustic characteristics like a coat. It said my name. Then it said something else. I transcribed it immediately, in the log, in the precise handwriting I had maintained for 6 months in that station. I will reproduce it here exactly as I wrote it, because exactness is what I have, exactness is what I am, and I need you to understand that this is not a reconstructed memory or an interpreted impression. I wrote it down as it happened. It said, "You've been sending to us for a long time. We've been listening. Don't tell them what you heard. They won't believe you and it won't matter. We know where the station is. We know where you live. Keep transmitting." The satellite uplink restored itself at 0600 the following morning. A message was waiting in the queue from my supervisor, timestamped from 6 days earlier, which the system had held in some buffer during the outage. It said only, "Received your report. Technical team reviewing. Continue standard protocol. Do not attempt to respond to anomalous transmissions. Do not attempt to respond." He knew. Or he knew something. Enough to include that instruction. I sat with that message for a long time, thinking about what it meant that this instruction existed, that someone in Anchorage had received my report and consulted a technical team, and the guidance that came back was not "we're sending someone" or "shut down the frequency" or "here is an explanation for what you're experiencing." The guidance was, "Do not respond, and keep transmitting. Keep transmitting." I finished my contract. I want you to understand that. I did not leave early. I did not break protocol. I transmitted every 6 hours for the remaining 8 weeks, and I did not respond to the frequency, and I documented everything with the same methodical precision I had brought to this work for 11 years. I don't know whether I stayed because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't, or because the structure of the work was the only thing holding me together, or because some part of me, the engineer's son, the mathematician's son, was still trying to collect enough data to understand. The last night, I sat at the console after the 2200 transmission and waited. The breathing came at 3 a.m., as it had for 8 weeks. Then the silence. Then the voice. It said, "Good work." I flew up the next morning on the charter. I flew to Fairbanks and then to Anchorage, and I went to the company office and I sat across from my supervisor, a man named Garrett who had a clean desk and careful eyes, and I told him everything that I have told you. He listened without interruption. He took no notes. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said the company appreciated my professionalism and that my completion bonus would be deposited within 10 business days. I asked him what was on that frequency. He said, "The technical team's assessment was that you experienced an unusual atmospheric propagation phenomenon consistent with documented ionospheric anomalies in high-latitude environments." I said, "That's not what it was." He said, "That's the assessment." I asked him whether other operators at that station had reported similar experiences. He straightened a pen on his desk. He said the station had operated for 9 years with various personnel on rotating contracts, and that atmospheric anomalies were a documented feature of high-latitude radio operation. I asked him whether any operators had left early. He said, "Some contracts end for various reasons." I asked him whether he could tell me anything real. Whether, in a conversation between 2 adults who both understood that the exchange we were having was a performance, he could tell me one real thing about what I had spent 6 months transmitting into and what had been transmitting back. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at his desk. Then he said, very quietly, "Don't go back to that area. Don't try to find the station. Don't file any public reports. He paused. Your bonus will be in your account Friday. I live in Boise again. Same apartment. Same truck, though it's older now. Different savings account. I closed the old one and opened a new one at a different bank because I needed to do something concrete and deliberate to mark the line between before and after, and that was what I could think of. I work for a local municipality now, maintaining civic broadcast infrastructure, which means I spend my days with radio equipment and transmission towers, and I have never once, in the years since Alaska, heard anything come back from a transmission that should have been silent. But I check. Every time. The same way I checked every time in that station in the 14 weeks before the echo started, when checking was just habit and verification and the satisfying confirmation of a world behaving according to its stated parameters. Now I check differently. With my hand on the gain dial and my eyes on the receiver's signal display and the specific, unwavering attention of a man who knows that the silence on a frequency is not always absence. Sometimes it is patience. I still don't know what was on that frequency. I have constructed theories. I have researched classified government communication projects, military installations in the Alaskan interior, experimental atmospheric research programs. I have found fragments of things that might be relevant and nothing that is conclusively explanatory. I have the audio recordings from my secondary device, 112 hours of transmissions and echoes and breathing in the voice that was built from my voice, on 2 encrypted hard drives and a fire safe under my bed. I have never played them for anyone. Not because I don't want to be believed. Because when I imagine sitting in a room with another person and pressing play and hearing that voice come out of a speaker, the voice that is mine but isn't mine, that learned itself from 14 weeks of listening to me, that knew my name and my errors and where I lived, I feel something that I suspect would stop me from ever sleeping again. The company dissolved in 2022. The Anchorage office closed. Garrett, my supervisor, is not findable through any professional network I have access to. The station's coordinates, which I have never shared with anyone, show as undeveloped forest on every satellite map I have checked. As if it isn't there. As if it was never there. But I was there. For 6 months, in the dark, in the cold, at the edge of the world, transmitting into something that listened and learned and spoke back. Methodically. Patiently. With the focused, comprehensive attention of something that had all the time it needed and knew, with a certainty I could hear in every returned syllable, that I was not going anywhere. I keep the hard drives under the bed. I sleep with the light on. And every night, in the specific way of a man who knows that not all silences are empty, I lie still and I listen. And I wait to hear if anything has found its way back. I took the job because my marriage was falling apart and I needed the money. That's the honest truth. No heroic narrative, no sense of adventure, no romanticized idea of conquering the Alaskan wilderness. Just a man in his late 30s with a second mortgage on a house in Spokane, a wife who had stopped looking at him during dinner, and a daughter who was starting to ask questions about why Daddy seemed so sad all the time. When the recruiter called me, a man named Dale with a flat Midwestern accent and the kind of cheerful professionalism that makes you trust people you absolutely should not trust, I said yes before he finished explaining the compensation package. 8 months at a remote gold mining operation in the interior of Alaska, somewhere in the vast nothing between Fairbanks and the edge of what most Americans would recognize as civilization. The pay was extraordinary. $43 an hour as a maintenance technician, housing and meals fully covered, a completion bonus that would wipe out a significant portion of what we owed on the house. Dale said the location was off-grid by design, which I interpreted as a quirky corporate way of saying the camp was rural. I did not understand, at that point, what off-grid truly meant in the context of Alaska in November. I had never been to Alaska. I had never been anywhere that did not have a gas station within 15 minutes of where I stood. I flew into Fairbanks on a Tuesday in late September. The city surprised me, small but real, with chain restaurants and a university and people walking dogs on sidewalks. I spent one night at a hotel near the airport, ate a burger at a place downtown, called my wife. She asked why I'd be back. I told her 8 months. She said okay, and the silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it, the kind you can feel pressing against your chest through a phone line. My daughter got on and told me she'd lost a tooth. I told her to leave it under the pillow and that the tooth fairy would come. She said, "Daddy, I know it's actually you." She was 8 years old. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I did something in between that felt like neither. The next morning, a company truck picked me up at 5 a.m. The driver was a quiet man named Hector who worked for the camp as a supply runner. He drove north and then northwest and then along roads that progressively narrowed and then disappeared into gravel and then into something that barely qualified as a path. The landscape transformed gradually from the familiar gas stations, transmission towers, the occasional farmhouse, into something that I had no reference for. Trees closed in and then thinned out. The sky turned enormous. We crossed frozen creek beds and drove along ridge lines where the drop to the left was several hundred feet of nothing. I asked Hector how far we were going. He said, "Far." I laughed. He didn't. We arrived at the camp after 6 hours of driving. It was a cluster of prefabricated buildings arranged without particular logic on a flat stretch of land adjacent to a worked hillside of exposed earth and timber supports. There were 8 of us, myself, 5 miners, a cook named Gerald, and the supervisor. His name was Burl McKenzie. He was 53 years old, heavy-set, with a thick gray beard and eyes the color of old dishwater. He shook my hand with a grip that lasted 3 seconds too long and smiled with his mouth only. "Glad you made it," he said. "We needed someone reliable." I didn't understand what that meant until later. The first week was unremarkable. The work was physical but manageable: diesel generators, hydraulic equipment, pump systems that kept the mine shafts from flooding. I was competent at what I did, which seemed to please Burl in a way that made me faintly uncomfortable from the beginning, though I couldn't articulate why. He watched me work. Not in a supervisory way, more like someone observing something they'd been waiting for. At meals he sat at the head of the table and controlled the conversation, steering it away from hometowns and families and anything that connected the men at that table to the world outside the camp perimeter. I noticed it but filed it under personality quirk and moved on. The landscape was terrifying and beautiful in equal measure, and sometimes it was hard to tell the difference between the two. Alaska in October is a study in extremes. The light disappeared earlier each day, and by the 3rd week I was waking up in darkness and returning to my bunk in darkness, and the sun was a brief, pale guest that appeared around noon and vanished again before I could finish being grateful for it. The silence was the most disorienting thing. Not the absence of noise, exactly, but the presence of a silence so complete and deliberate that it felt like something listening. I had never experienced anything like it. Growing up in Ohio, living in Spokane, there is always ambient sound. Traffic, neighbors, the mechanical hum of civilization. In that camp, on nights when the wind dropped, I could hear my own heartbeat, and it sounded frightened. I called my wife every 3 days on the camp satellite phone. The calls were brief, functional, careful. She told me about our daughter's school play. I told her the work was fine. We did not talk about the things that had broken between us. The satellite phone was in a small office adjacent to Burl's quarters, and although I had no proof, I developed the uncanny conviction that he was listening. I began choosing my words accordingly. I told myself I was being paranoid. That was the first lie I told myself in Alaska. It would not be the last. It was during the 4th week that I noticed the notebook. I had gone into the operations office to pull a maintenance record for one of the generators, and the desk was covered in the ordinary debris of an industrial worksite: invoices, equipment logs, weather printouts. Among them, left open as though Burl had simply stepped out momentarily, was a spiral-bound notebook with his handwriting filling the pages in dense, small columns. Maya caught my name before I could look away. I read 3 lines before my brain caught up with what my eyes were seeing and told me to stop. The entries were dated. Daily. My name appeared in every one I could see, followed by observations. Woke at 0612. Breakfast, oatmeal, 2 cups coffee. Bathroom 0634, duration 11 minutes. Work started 0710. Each entry was that specific, that meticulous, that comprehensive. I flipped back several pages and found the same pattern beginning on my first day at camp. Every meal I had eaten. Every time I had used the toilet. How many cigarettes, and I only smoked 3 or 4 a week, a habit I thought was invisible. The duration of my phone calls. What I said. Not paraphrase, direct quotation. Work is fine. Everything's okay. I set the notebook down precisely as I had found it. I took the maintenance record. I walked back to the generator shed and sat on a metal crate for 20 minutes, not moving. I want you to understand what that discovery felt like in the context of where I was. If you were reading this from your home in a suburb somewhere, from a city apartment, from anywhere with neighbors and roads and reliable cell service, you cannot fully replicate the specific terror of that moment. I was 200 miles from the nearest town of any size. I had no vehicle. The supply truck came once every 2 weeks. The satellite phone was in his office. My cell phone had not shown a signal since the 2nd hour of the drive out of Fairbanks. There was nowhere to go and no one to call, and the man who had been cataloging my bathroom habits in a notebook was my direct supervisor, my only point of contact with the company, and the person who controlled every resource I needed to survive. I did nothing. I kept working. I smiled at meals. I said good morning. I performed the complete theater of a man who had not seen what he had seen, because performing that theater felt like the only rational choice available to me. I don't know if that makes me smart or cowardly. I think it makes me human. But I began to notice other things, now that I was noticing. The camp radio, a boxy VHF unit mounted in the common room that could theoretically reach emergency services or other operations in the region, had a handset that sat slightly wrong in its cradle. One evening while Burl was out doing his perimeter walk, I picked it up and tried to transmit. Dead. I unscrewed the back panel and found the transmitting circuit had been neatly cut. Not broken, not corroded, cut. A clean line with something sharp, deliberate and specific. Someone who knew exactly which component to remove. I put the panel back. I sat down. I looked at the walls of the common room, which were decorated with a mounted caribou head and a laminated map of Alaska and a calendar from 3 years ago, and I thought about my daughter telling me she knew it was actually me who left money under the pillow, and I felt something dark and cold settle into the center of my chest and stay there. 2 days later I found the satellite phone disassembled. Not visibly, from the outside it looked exactly as it always had. But when I tried to place my scheduled call to my wife, there was nothing. Not static, not a connection error message. Nothing. I held the handset and heard the specific, maddening silence of a device that had been made to appear functional while being rendered completely useless. I hung it up and walked back to the generator shed and counted to 10 slowly several times until my hands stopped shaking. That night at dinner, Burl told a story about a man he'd worked with in the Yukon in the 90s. A technician, he said, who had gotten ideas about leaving a job early. He told the story with the same flat, pleasant expression he used for everything, cutting his food methodically while he talked. The man had decided to walk out, Burl said. 40 miles to the nearest road. In October. He paused to chew. The other men at the table were eating and not quite looking at each other. He never said what happened to the man in the Yukon. He just let the story in there, in the middle of the wilderness, and picked up his coffee cup. I looked at the 5 miners. Gary and Pete, 2 brothers from Wasilla who kept mostly to themselves. A man named Okonkwo from Anchorage who was on his 2nd season at the camp. A young kid, 22 maybe, who everyone called Rabbit and who laughed too easily at Burl's jokes in the way that people laugh when they are afraid of what happens when they don't. And Denny, who was 50-something and had been working remote mining camps for 3 decades and who had the eyes of someone who had decided that endurance was the only philosophy worth practicing. None of them met my gaze during Burl's story. That told me everything. I began to construct contingencies. I mapped the camp obsessively in my head, every building, every vehicle, every piece of equipment that might be useful. There was a quad ATV used for perimeter checks that Burl kept in a locked shed. There was a cache of cold weather gear in the operations building. There were emergency flares in the first aid locker. I began to sleep with my work boots on. Then the weather turned. What had been cold became a different category of cold entirely. The temperature dropped to -30 in the 2nd week of November and then kept going. -38. -41 on a Tuesday morning when I checked the thermometer outside the equipment shed and stood there looking at it for a long time, understanding in my body rather than my mind what the number meant for a person on foot in open terrain. At -40, exposed skin begins to suffer frostbite in under 10 minutes. At -40, your breath freezes as it leaves your mouth. At -40, the wilderness does not need any assistance killing you. The generator failed on Friday night. I use the word failed because that is what Burl called it at dinner, his voice carrying the ordinary professional irritation of a man dealing with a mechanical problem. He looked at me across the table and said he'd need me to take a look in the morning, once there was daylight. I said of course. I ate my food. I went to bed and lay in the dark and thought very carefully. Because I had serviced the generator 2 days before. I knew its condition. A machine in that condition does not simply fail. I got up at 3 a.m. The camp was silent. I dressed in every layer I had, moving slowly and quietly in the dark, and I went to the generator shed. I did not need to open the panel to confirm what I expected. I could tell from the exterior, from the smell, from the small specific way the machine sat differently than it should. But I opened it anyway. I needed to see it. A major component had been removed. Not failed, removed. Taken out with tools, carefully, by someone who knew what they were doing. Without the generator, we had battery backup for perhaps 18 hours. Without heat, the temperature inside the buildings would equalize with the temperature outside in a matter of hours after that. -40. Everything perishable would freeze. The vehicles would not start. A person without adequate heat at those temperatures does not survive a night. I stood in the generator shed with my flashlight and my hands were shaking but not from cold. I had worked maintenance jobs for 15 years. I had fixed things in difficult conditions in difficult places. I had always been, in some fundamental way, a man who could solve the problem in front of him. And standing there, in the dark, 200 miles from Fairbanks, with a deliberately disabled generator and a supervisor who kept a notebook cataloging my bathroom habits and a radio that had been surgically incapacitated, I understood that I was not facing a problem I could fix. I was facing something I had to survive. I took the emergency flares from the first aid locker. I took the best cold weather gear I could find. I went to Denny's bunk and shook him awake, and when he opened his eyes I held a finger to my lips. He looked at me for a long moment, this man who had spent 30 years in the far north, who had the endurance of someone who had given up on anything beyond endurance, and he nodded once. We left before dawn. We did not take the road. We went across the terrain, using a compass I borrowed weeks ago under the pretense of orienteering practice, and never returned. We did not speak for the first 4 hours. We walked. The cold was a physical entity, a presence, something that pressed against every inch of exposed skin and found the gaps in clothing and entered through them with focused, malevolent precision. The sun came up pale and small and useless at around 11 o'clock and gave us light but no warmth. We fired a flare when we heard a plane, distant and small against the enormous sky, and then another, and then nothing. We walked for 9 hours before we reached a logging road. We followed it for 3 more hours before a truck found us. A man and his teenage son, heading back toward Nanana after checking on property. They took one look at us and put us in the cab without asking questions. The heater in that truck was the most beautiful thing I have ever felt. I reported everything to Alaska State Troopers out of Fairbanks. I gave them the notebook. I had taken it on the way out, slipping it under my coat while Denny created a brief distraction, a decision I had made in that generator shed and executed in a window of 30 seconds. The troopers drove out to the camp. When they arrived, Burl was there. The other men were there. The generator component had been reinstalled. The satellite phone worked perfectly. The radio worked perfectly. Burl told them I had become unstable, paranoid, that I had threatened other workers before disappearing, that the notebook was a standard operational log that I had apparently misinterpreted in a mental health episode. I sat in that trooper station in Fairbanks and watched the investigation go sideways in real time. They were professional and they were not unkind, but the man they had driven out to find was calm and cooperative and had a plausible explanation for everything, and I was a man with visible stress fractures and a wild story and 9 hours of frostbite pallor still fading from my face. I asked about the 2 previous technicians. The troopers went quiet in the way that people go quiet when a question touches something they already know about and have not resolved. One of them said the cases were open. He did not say open as in actively investigated. He said it the way you say a word when you mean its opposite. Denny corroborated my account. Every word. It didn't matter. Burl had something that Denny and I didn't have. He had never left, and we had. In the arithmetic of credibility in a remote location dispute, presence outweighs testimony almost every time. My wife flew to Fairbanks. I remember seeing her walk through the doors of the station and the look on her face, not the face of a woman who had stopped looking at her husband at dinner, but the face of someone who had looked up and found that what she'd been taking for granted was almost gone. We didn't talk about the things that had broken between us that night. We talked about other things. I held her hand and looked out the window at the Fairbanks night, which was complete and absolute and cold in a way I would never fully stop feeling. I never went back. The camp continued to operate for another 2 seasons before I heard it had shut down. I heard this from a guy in a forum thread who'd been through a similar camp in a different part of the state and was looking for others who'd had comparable experiences. There were 17 responses in that thread. 17 people in that thread describing operations across the Alaskan interior, near Talk, near Delta Junction, near the Brooks Range, each story different in its details and identical in its structure. The isolation. The equipment that failed strategically. The supervisor who knew too much. The men who came before and didn't come after. No one was ever charged with anything. I still have the notebook. It's in a plastic container under the workbench in my garage in Spokane. I have never shown it to my daughter. I have never shown it to anyone who didn't already know about it. Sometimes I go into the garage late at night when everyone is asleep and I take it out and open it and read the entries, my name, my meals, my habits, my words, and I try to understand what I was to that man. A target. A resource. A problem to be managed in a place where management had a different meaning than anywhere else. What I know is this: the wilderness doesn't need to be malevolent to kill you. It is simply indifferent, and indifference at -40 is sufficient. What Burl understood, what made him dangerous in a way that the cold alone could never be, was that he had learned to use that indifference as a tool. The land doesn't care. He knew the land doesn't care. And in that space between human cruelty and geological indifference, men disappeared and the paperwork said inconclusive and the cases stayed open in the way that means closed. I checked the locks on my house every night before bed. Both deadbolts, the garage side door, the back slider. My wife has noticed. She doesn't say anything about it. She just watches me check them, and then we go to bed, and sometimes I lie there in the dark of our ordinary American bedroom, our ordinary American house in our ordinary American city, and I listen to the silence, and I am grateful, desperately and specifically grateful, that it is the silence of a neighborhood and not the silence of 200 miles of Alaskan wilderness in November. Because that silence, the real silence, the one without neighbors or traffic or the mechanical hum of the world that most of us live inside of and never notice, that silence doesn't just sit there. It watches you back. And sometimes I think about those two men who held my job before me. I think about their names, which I eventually found in county records after months of searching. I think about their families, who presumably received phone calls at some point, or letters, or nothing at all. I think about what open case means for the people who love them. And I think about Burl Mackenzie, who is almost certainly still out there, somewhere north of Fairbanks, waiting for someone reliable. I have always been the kind of person who counts things. Not compulsively, not in the clinical sense, not the way my college roommate used to tap light switches in multiples of 4 before leaving a room, not the way anxiety manifests in people who need the world organized into manageable units. I counted things the way a careful person counts things. The way someone who grew up in a household where attention to detail was a moral virtue counts things. My father was a structural engineer in Portland, Oregon, and he raised me with the conviction that the difference between a bridge that stands and a bridge that kills people is the number of times someone bothered to check the calculation. I internalized that. I counted inventory at the hardware store where I worked through college. I counted the days on my work calendar, the miles on my truck, the items in my camping pack before every trip. Counting was not anxiety. Counting was competence. So when I say that I counted 5 tents on the 14th night of the Denali expedition, I need you to understand that I am not describing a miscount. I am not describing exhaustion-induced error or altitude-related perceptual distortion or any of the rational explanations I have offered myself in the years since, late at night, when I am trying to make the memory sit still long enough to become something I can live with. I counted 5 tents because there were 5 tents. And then I counted again, twice, with my headlamp moving deliberately from shape to shape in the dark, and there were 6. But I am getting ahead of the story. Let me start at the beginning, which is what my therapist in Anchorage tells me I should do. Start at the beginning and move forward. Don't jump to the tent. Don't leave with the photograph. Tell it like a normal story, she says, because it is a normal story. It is a story about 5 people who went into the wilderness and came back changed, and the changing is real even if the details are hard to believe, and real things that happen to real people deserve to be told in order. So, the beginning. There were 5 of us. I need to describe us with some specificity because the specificity matters, because this was not a group of reckless thrill seekers or inexperienced outdoor enthusiasts who wandered into the Alaskan backcountry without adequate preparation. We were 5 responsible American adults in our 30s with between us approximately 60 years of combined wilderness experience, planning and equipment that had been assembled over 8 months, and a route that had been vetted by 2 independent wilderness guides before we set a single boot on the ground. Kyle was 36, a physical therapist from Tacoma with thighs like bridge cables and the navigational instincts of a man who had been reading topographical maps since he could read. My best friend since high school. The kind of person you want making decisions when the options are all bad. Renata was 33, a structural biologist from Seattle who had spent 3 summers doing field research in remote locations and who approached the wilderness with the same systematic precision she brought to everything, which is to say, completely. Marcus was 38, a high school history teacher from Eugene, quieter than the rest of us, the one who remembered to drink water and eat and check in on whether everyone was doing okay, which in retrospect was the role the group most needed. And Diane, 34, who was Kyle's wife and the most experienced backcountry traveler among us, who had done a solo traverse of the Brooks Range 2 summers before and who moved through difficult terrain with the unhurried, economical grace of someone who had learned that the wilderness does not reward urgency. And me, 35, systems analyst, Portland. The one who counted things. We had been planning the expedition for the better part of a year. 40 days in the Denali Wilderness, not the mountain itself, not the technical ascent that draws climbers from around the world to that particular wedge of Alaskan stone and ice, but the broader wilderness area surrounding it, which is 6 million acres of terrain that includes some of the most remote and spectacular and genuinely hostile landscape on the North American continent. We had coordinated our departure from our respective cities, flown into Anchorage, driven the park's highway north through Wasilla and the Matsu Valley and then further north, watching the landscape drain itself of human evidence with the steady, irreversible quality of a tide going out. We passed through Talkeetna, which is a real town but a small one, the kind of place where the ratio of mountains to people becomes viscerally apparent. We reached the park entrance and signed in at the ranger station and received our backcountry permit and the standard safety briefing, which covers bears and weather and river crossings and the particular advice about wildlife encounters that sounds common sense in a ranger station and takes on a different texture when you are 4 days into the backcountry with nothing between you and whatever is out there except your own judgment and whatever you brought on your back. The first 13 days were extraordinary in the way that the Alaskan wilderness is extraordinary, which is to say, in a way that makes ordinary language feel inadequate and slightly embarrassing. I have been to beautiful places. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, where natural beauty is so constant and overwhelming that you develop a certain habituated relationship with it, the way you stop hearing a sound that never changes. The Denali Wilderness is not like that. It does not allow habituation. Every day presented a landscape so complete and so indifferent to human presence that it produced, in me at least, a feeling I can only describe as productive terror, a fear that was also a clarification, a reminder that the world is vastly larger and older and less concerned with your existence than the daily texture of American life encourages you to believe. We camped each night in different locations, following the route, covering our planned mileage with the satisfaction of people executing a well-made plan. The weather was cooperative. The bears we encountered were the manageable kind, present, real, requiring appropriate response, but not the kind of encounter that ends with people airlifted out. We were a functional group. We ate well. We slept. We talked in the evenings about our lives, our plans, the small and large things that constitute a life being lived in good faith. Diane and Kyle were trying to have a child and had been for 2 years, and she talked about it one night with the quiet, unguarded honesty that remote places sometimes draw out of people who would maintain careful privacy under normal circumstances. Marcus told us about a student he'd been worried about all year, a kid in his junior history class who reminded him of himself at 17. Renata said almost nothing about her personal life, which was consistent with her general approach, but one evening she described what she loved about her research, the moment when a system reveals its underlying structure, when the pattern that was always there becomes visible, and she said it with an illuminated quality that made me understand something essential about her. I am telling you about these people because I want you to know that they were real. Fully, specifically real. I want you to carry that into what comes next. On the evening of the 13th day, we made camp in a broad, flat river valley with a creek running through it and a line of spruce along the eastern edge and the mountains enormous and white to the north. We set up our tents in the standard configuration, not clustered, but within sight of each other, spread across perhaps 30 feet of flat ground. I set up my tent last, as I usually did, and before I zipped the fly I stood in the cooling evening air and counted. 4 tents, mine included. Kyle and Diane sharing the red 2-person tent to the north. Renata's gray solo tent at the south end. Marcus's green tent in the middle. Mine, blue, to the west. 4 tents. I zipped the fly and went to sleep. I woke at 2:17 a.m. I know the time because I checked my watch specifically, a habit from home that I had maintained on the trip. I am a methodical person. I woke because something had changed in the quality of the silence, not a sound, but the removal of a sound I had been hearing without consciously registering, the small creak noise that had been the ambient texture of sleep for several hours. It had not stopped. I simply became aware of it in a different way, the way you become aware of your own heartbeat in a quiet room. I lay still for a moment. I was not frightened. I was alert in the specific way that sleeping outdoors makes you alert, a state of readiness that is neither full wakefulness nor sleep, calibrated to the environment. Then I unzipped the tent and looked out and counted. I counted twice. I counted 3 times. The headlamp moved from shape to shape in the dark, each tent casting a slightly different shadow, each one distinct in outline and position. My blue tent. Kyle and Diane's red tent. Renata's gray tent. Marcus's green tent. And one more. Positioned at the edge of the spruce line, perhaps 40 feet from Marcus's tent, oriented the same direction as ours, its fly taut and properly staked. Not a piece of debris. Not a shadow. A tent. A camping tent, the same category of object as the others, with a working zipper and aluminum poles and a properly deployed rain fly. I counted it 4 times. It was there every time I counted. I woke Kyle first, because Kyle is the person you wake when you need someone to assess a situation without panic. He came out of his tent and I pointed and he looked in his face to the thing that competent people's faces do when they encounter something outside their operational framework, a brief, complete stillness, the expression of a system running a check and not returning an expected result. Then he woke the others. We stood in the dark, 5 people in varying stages of consciousness, looking at the 6th tent. No light inside it. No movement. No sound. The creak was audible again. The mountains were invisible in the dark but present, enormous, their presence felt rather than seen in the way you feel large things you cannot see. Kyle called out. A greeting, then an inquiry, is someone there? Are you okay? Do you need help? Standard protocol. The kind of thing you do when you encounter a person in the wilderness who might be in distress. The tent did not move. Nothing moved. We approached together. Kyle unzipped the outer fly. Inside, a sleeping bag, used, compressed in the specific way sleeping bags compress under a person's weight over multiple nights of use. A headlamp with the batteries removed, placed neatly beside the sleeping bag. A small stuffed sack that contained, when Kyle opened it, nothing but a folded piece of paper. And 5 photographs. I will describe the photographs because the photographs are the thing that broke something in each of us in ways I am still, years later, attempting to fully inventory. They were Polaroid prints. 5 of them, each one a different image, each image showing one of us sleeping inside our respective tents. The images were taken from outside, through the tent fabric, the walls of our tents visible as a translucent membrane between the lens and the subject, slightly distorting the image, giving each photograph a quality of voyeuristic intimacy that made the skin physically recoil. Each one was clearly, identifiably the person whose tent it was taken through. You could see Kyle's hand outside the sleeping bag. You could see Renata's hair spread on the ground pad. You could see Marcus's mouth slightly open in sleep. The photographs were time-stamped. The Polaroid film had a manufacturer's timestamp in the lower right margin. They were taken that night. The previous 2 hours. I looked at my photograph for a long time. Me, asleep, in my blue tent, seen through the blue fabric from outside. The specific angle of the shot placed the photographer perhaps 8 feet from my tent wall, which would have put them roughly at the boundary of where the 6th tent was now staked. Close enough to hear me breathing. Close enough that if I had moved suddenly in sleep, if I had rolled toward the tent wall, I would have been perhaps 18 inches from the lens. From the person holding the lens. The folded piece of paper in the stuffed sack had 4 words written on it in pencil, in a neat and unhurried hand. Not a warning. Not a threat. Not anything that could be taken to a ranger station and classified as evidence of criminal intent by any legal definition I am aware of. 4 words that were somehow more frightening for their clarity, for the absolute directness of them, for the implication they carried about the nature of what had been happening around us in the dark. I know you're leaving. We left before dawn. We did not discuss it. Kyle said we're going, and we moved with the practiced efficiency of people who have trained for emergency egress, and we did not take the full camp down. We took what we needed to move fast and move safely, and we left the rest. We did not take the 6th tent down. We did not take the photographs. Kyle took the piece of paper, and I do not know why, and I have never asked him. We moved south and east, off route, using Kyle's navigation, pushing toward the nearest trail junction that connected to a staff ranger station. We did not talk for the first 3 hours. The silence among us was different from the silence of the wilderness, which was its own enormous and indifferent thing. Our silence was the silence of 5 people separately processing something for which they did not yet have adequate language. At approximately 0900, with the light fully established and the mountains visible again and the terrain navigable, Renata stopped walking and turned around and looked at the direction we had come from. We all stopped. We looked with her. The valley was behind us, several miles back, invisible behind ridgelines and forest. There was nothing to see. There was never anything to see. Whatever was back there had always been back there, in the trees, behind the ridgelines, operating in the dark at the specific distance that made it impossible to locate and impossible to dismiss. She said, very quietly, "How long?" Not a question. A statement that contained a question inside it. We reached the ranger station at 1740. A ranger named Kowalski took our report with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had heard things in this backcountry and had developed a protocol for receiving them. He asked specific questions. He took notes. He asked to see the piece of paper. Kyle gave it to him. When Kowalski read it, his expression did the same thing Kyle's had done in the dark at 2:17 a.m., that brief, complete stillness, the system running its check. Then he said something that I have turned over so many times it has worn smooth, like a stone that has been handled until its original surface is gone. He said, "We're going to need to go back and document the site." Then, almost to himself, looking at the piece of paper, not the first time in this section. I asked him what he meant. He said, "I can't discuss other incidents." I asked him whether people had been hurt. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Not that we know of. Not that we know of." I have unpacked those 5 words more times than I can count. Not that we know of, which is different from no. Which is different from the incidents were investigated and resolved and the area is safe. Which is different from anything reassuring. Not that we know of is the language of an open file, of a case without a bottom, of a pattern that has been noticed and documented and not explained and not stopped. The investigation found the campsite. Found the tent, still standing, still staked. Found the sleeping bag. Found the headlamp with its batteries removed. Did not find the photographs, which we had taken without thinking, pocketing them as we left in the instinctive way that people take evidence of their own vulnerability, as if carrying it means controlling it. Did not find the person who had been living in the tent. Did not find footprints adequate to establish direction of travel. The ground in that area was too rocky, and whatever time had passed between departure and the ranger's arrival had allowed weather to complicate what evidence remained. Did not find, in the surrounding area, any indication of a base camp or supply cache or any infrastructure that would explain how a person had been maintaining a sustained presence in that section of backcountry. The ranger's file on the incident, which I obtained through a public records request 2 years later after enough time had passed that I felt capable of reading it without the words rearranging themselves into something I couldn't manage, contained 4 pages of documentation and a 1-sentence conclusion. I will reproduce the conclusion here because it is the most frightening sentence I have ever read, more frightening than anything in the incident itself, because it is the sentence of an institution that has looked at a thing and decided that the looking is complete. Subject not identified, no evidence of criminal intent established, file to remain open pending additional reports from sector. Pending additional reports from sector. I live in Portland still. Same city, different apartment. I moved after Alaska, which I recognize as a displacement behavior, a way of changing the environment because I couldn't change what had happened in it. I still go camping. Not in Alaska. Not yet, possibly not ever, but I go camping because the alternative, surrendering the wilderness to what happened in it, felt like a specific kind of defeat I was not willing to accept. I camp with Kyle and Diane, who are parents now, their daughter 2 years old and entirely unaware that her parents spent 3 hours walking in terrified silence through the Alaskan backcountry on a September morning. I camp with Marcus, who still teaches history and still worries about his students. Renata moved to Edinburgh for a research position, and I see her once a year when she comes back to the States. We do not talk about the expedition. We talk around it, the way you talk around a structural feature that has changed the shape of a room. You navigate it, you acknowledge its presence through the navigation, but you do not address it directly because addressing it directly would require agreeing on what it is, and we have never been able to do that. What I know, what I have confirmed through my own methodical accounting of the facts, a person or persons unknown maintained a camp in our proximity for an unknown period of time, possibly the full 14 days we were in that section. They moved at night. They documented us while we slept. They photographed us with the unhurried precision of someone conducting a project, not committing an impulsive act. They left a note that indicated awareness of our departure plans that were in our permit filing, accessible to the Park Service, but not publicly posted, not visible to a casual observer. They left their camp intact when they left, which means they either had another camp to go to or they left nothing because leaving nothing was intentional. I know one more thing. I have known it since the ranger station, since Kowalski said not the first time in this section, and I have confirmed it in the way you confirm things you don't want confirmed, through the slow accumulation of small corroborating details that individually mean little and collectively mean everything. Whoever was in that 610 was not there by accident. They were not lost, not in distress, not a disoriented hiker who had stumbled into proximity with our camp. They were there because we were there. They had been there, in that section of backcountry between the Denali wilderness boundary and the river valley where we had made camp, for as long as we had been there or longer. Waiting. Watching the kind of patient, nocturnal attention that requires either extraordinary discipline or relationship with darkness and isolation that most people will never develop. And the thing I cannot stop returning to, the detail that wakes me at 2:17 a.m. sometimes, which is the exact time I woke on the 14th night, a coincidence I have noted and cannot explain, is the note. I know you're leaving. Present tense. Now I knew. Now I could tell. I know. Written before we knew. Written and placed in that stuffed sack before the moment we stood in the dark and looked at 6 tents and made the decision that we were going. Before Kyle said we're going and we began to move. The note was already written. The note had been waiting in that tent, in that stuffed sack, perhaps for hours before we found it. As if the decision had been made for us. As if leaving was never our choice to begin with, but something we were being allowed to do. Something that had watched us sleep for 14 nights had decided it was time for us to go. And it had known, before we did, that we would. I count things still. My camping gear before every trip. The tents, specifically, I count them when they go up and I count them again before I sleep and I count them when I wake in the night, which I do more often than I used to. My hand finds the headlamp in the dark and the light moves and I count. I have never found more tents than I set up. Not yet. But the counting is no longer the satisfied verification of a careful man in a predictable world. It is something else now. It is the act of a person who knows that the number can change. Who knows that the wilderness is not empty simply because it appears empty, that the silence is not absence, that the dark between trees is not uninhabited just because you cannot see what inhabits it. It is the act of a person counting because he is afraid of what the count will be. And somewhere in the 6 million acres of the Denali wilderness, in the spruce forest and the river valleys and the enormous indifferent dark, someone who has never been identified and never been caught is still, in all likelihood, counting too. I have pulled things from the ocean that I cannot explain. Most commercial fishermen will tell you the same thing if you get enough drinks in them and the night is late enough and the particular weight of what they've seen has been pressing on them long enough that the pressure finally needs somewhere to go. The sea keeps secrets the way a locked room keeps secrets. Everything is still in there, still present, still exactly as it was left. The ocean just doesn't have a door you can open. It shows you what it wants to show you and keeps the rest, and after 18 years working the waters off Kodiak Island I had developed a working relationship with that reality. You see things you don't understand. You file them away. You keep fishing. I was not prepared for the summer of 2016. You need to understand who I was before that summer to understand what it did to me. I am not a superstitious man. I grew up in Everett, Washington, the son of a mechanic and a school librarian, and I inherited from them a combined distrust of anything that couldn't be explained by either a repair manual or a car catalog. I believed in cause and effect. I believed in weather patterns and tidal charts and the mechanical reliability of a well-maintained diesel engine. I believed that strange things happen at sea because the sea was a genuinely strange environment, and that the human brain, deprived of familiar reference points and subjected to exhaustion and isolation and the particular monotony of open water, was capable of constructing elaborate misperceptions from ordinary material. I had believed all of that for 18 years. I do not believe all of that anymore. The Marguerite is a 52-foot combination vessel, rigged for both longline and pot fishing, out of the port of Kodiak. I have worked her since 2004, first as a deckhand and then as first mate under Captain Roy Tesler, who was 61 years old in 2016 and had been fishing Alaskan waters since before I was born. Roy was a man of extraordinary competence and extraordinary emotional economy. He expressed satisfaction by not expressing dissatisfaction, and his highest compliment was a single nod. In 18 years I had seen him rattled exactly twice. A rogue wave in the Gulf of Alaska in 2009 that came out of clear weather and nearly put us over. And the summer of 2016. We were running halibut longlines in June, working the ground south of Kodiak Island in the stretch of water between the island and the Alaska Peninsula. The weather had been cooperative, which in that part of the world means it had been merely unpleasant rather than actively homicidal. We were 3 days out of port, 6 men aboard including Roy, running our gear in the early morning light when one of the deckhands, a kid named Marcus, 24 years old and on his second season, spotted something off the starboard bow. It was a man. He was lying face up on what appeared to be a survival raft, one of those circular orange inflatable platforms with a low canopy, the kind that deploys automatically from a vessel in distress. The raft was 12 miles from shore, which in the context of the North Pacific is not 12 miles. It is a number that describes a particular category of impossibility. The water temperature was 41 degrees. The raft showed no markings we could identify from a distance. We altered course and came alongside. He was alive. That was the first impossible thing. He was a white male, I would have estimated late 40s or early 50s, wearing what had once been warm weather outdoor gear that was now soaked through and beginning to abrade from extended exposure. He was hypothermic. His core temperature when Roy checked him was 91 degrees, which is the number where cognitive function begins to degrade and the body starts making internal calculations about what to sacrifice in order to keep the essential machinery running. His lips were the color of a bruise. His hands were white to the wrists. But his eyes were open, and when I leaned over him on the deck of the Marguerite, he looked at me with an expression that I spent the next several months trying to categorize. He wasn't frightened. He wasn't relieved. He was looking at me the way you look at something you expected to see. We radioed the Coast Guard station at Kodiak immediately. We gave our position, described what we had, and were directed to transport the man to the port ourselves as we were closer than any available cutter. Roy altered course for Kodiak. The man was moved to a bunk below and wrapped in thermal blankets while Marcus monitored his temperature. I stayed with him for the first hour, sitting on the edge of the bunk opposite, watching him in the yellowish light of the below-deck cabin. He didn't speak for a long time. I asked him basic questions: name, what vessel he come from, how long he'd been in the water. He looked at the ceiling of the cabin and breathed. His breathing was the slow, deliberate breathing of a man concentrating on each breath individually, treating each one as a task that required his full attention. Then, very quietly, he said something that I did not react to in the moment because I did not fully process it in the moment. He said my name. My full name, first, middle, last, in a voice so low I thought perhaps I had misheard him. I asked him to repeat it. He turned his head and looked at me and closed his eyes. He did not speak again during the transit to Kodiak. The Coast Guard met us at the dock. Paramedics. 2 officers. The man was transferred to a stretcher and then to an ambulance, and I watched it leave with the specific feeling of a chapter ending before you understand what it was about. Roy filed the rescue report. I gave my statement. One of the Coast Guard officers took down the details with professional thoroughness and told us we might be contacted for a follow-up. We weren't. I went home to my apartment on the east side of Kodiak, which overlooks a parking lot and a stretch of bay in which I had always considered an entirely adequate place to live, and I sat on my couch and tried to reconstruct exactly what the man had said. I was tired. I had been awake for 22 hours. It was possible I had misheard. It was possible that hypothermia-induced delirium had caused him to produce sounds that my exhausted brain had assembled into recognizable patterns. The brain does that. The brain is an aggressive editor of raw experience. I told myself this. I made myself believe it. I went to sleep. We went back out 4 days later. We were running the same grounds, working a different section of the long-line gear, when Oleg, a Ukrainian-born deckhand who had been fishing Kodiak waters for 12 years and who possessed, in Roy's assessment, the best instincts of anyone on the boat, called out from the stern. His voice had something in it that I had not heard from Oleg before. Not alarm, exactly. Something quieter than alarm and more disturbing for its quietness. I went aft. The net had come up with its normal load of halibut and bycatch, the ordinary wet chaos of a long-line haul. But tangled in the mesh on the port side, caught in the way that objects sometimes catch when they have been in the water long enough to drift into a gear line, was a body. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say body, because the word allows for ambiguity and I do not want there to be ambiguity. This was not a person who had recently drowned. This was a person who had been in the water for a significant period of time, weeks, not days. The process that the ocean performs on a human body over that kind of duration is thorough and comprehensive, and I will not describe it in detail except to say that it is one of those things you see once and carry forever, a weight that does not decrease with time, only becomes more familiar. Roy called the Coast Guard. We held position. The body was recovered by a cutter that arrived 90 minutes later, and we gave our position and our account and waited while the light moved across the water and the day continued around us with the sea's complete indifference to human events. The officer who came aboard the cutter to take our statement was the same man who had processed a rescue report 2 months earlier. I recognized him. He recognized me. He looked at me with an expression that I cataloged carefully and have thought about many times since, a look that contained information he had already decided not to share. He asked standard questions. I gave standard answers. Then I asked him whether they had identified the man we'd rescued in June, whether the case was resolved. He stopped writing. He looked at his notepad. He looked at me. He said, "We're working to locate the original rescues for follow-up." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means the case is ongoing." I said, "Can you tell me anything about the man we pulled out of the water?" There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds, which is a long pause in a professional exchange between two people who have no reason to perform anything for each other. Then he said, quietly and with the specific careful diction of a man choosing each word with intention, "The individual recovered today has been preliminarily identified. If the identification is confirmed, you'll understand that the timeline presents certain inconsistencies." I did not understand what he meant. I told him so. He said, "The person you recovered in June. If the identification of today's recovery is confirmed." He stopped. He looked at the water. They may be the same person. I stood on the deck of the Marguerite and in the gray Alaskan summer light, 12 miles from shore, and felt the bottom drop out of something inside me. Not fear, exactly. Something more fundamental than fear. The sensation of a foundational assumption, one so basic you never thought to examine it, quietly and completely giving way. I said, "That's not possible." He said, "No. It isn't." He left. The cutter pulled away. Roy stood beside me at the stern and we watched it go without speaking. The water around us was black-green and cold and moved with the slow, massive indifference of something that has been here since long before us and will be here long after, and I felt, with a clarity that I had never felt before and have never quite recaptured since, exactly how small I was. Not metaphorically small. Physically, specifically, measurably small, in the middle of the Gulf of Alaska, on a 52-foot boat, surrounded by water in every direction and nothing else. Roy said, eventually, "Go check the gear." I went and checked the gear. That night, anchored in a protected cove off the coast of the Alaska Peninsula while the wind came up from the southwest and moved the boat in long, slow rolls, I lay in my bunk and went through every rational explanation I could construct. Misidentification. 2 different men who resembled each other. An error in the preliminary identification process. Forensic identification of bodies recovered from the ocean is not a precise science, particularly when the recovery and the identification are both preliminary. These were all possible. These were all plausible. None of them addressed what the man had said to me in the below-deck cabin of the Marguerite and in June. My full name. First, middle, last. I had never met this man before. I was certain of this. I have a reasonably good memory for faces, and his was not a face I recognized. There was no context in which a hypothermic man on a survival raft 12 miles from shore in the North Pacific should have known my middle name, which I have never used professionally, which does not appear in any public record I am aware of, which my mother chose because it was her father's name and which I have always slightly resented and therefore never volunteered. He knew it. I thought about this in the dark of the cove, with the wind moving the boat and the water knocking against the hull in a rhythm that had always been comforting to me and was not comforting to me that night. I thought about the way he had looked at me while I leaned over him on the deck. The absence of surprise in his eyes. The specific quality of his expression, not relief at rescue, not confusion from hypothermia, not the blankness of a man in shock. Recognition. He had looked at me with the expression of a man who recognized me. I had never seen him before in my life. The Coast Guard's report came back 6 weeks later. The body recovered in August was identified through dental records as a man named Peter Coyle, 51, originally from Kenai, Alaska, who had been reported missing after his commercial fishing vessel, a 38-foot gillnetter, failed to return to port in late June. The vessel was never found. The cause of death was listed as drowning, with exposure contributing. The estimated time in water was 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks. We had pulled the living man from the water in June. 6 to 8 weeks in the water placed his death in June. The same June. The overlap in the timeline was not a discrepancy that could be resolved by rounding errors or imprecise estimation. It was not a matter of a few days. If the identification was correct, and the troopers confirmed to me, when I pressed them, that it was correct, that the dental record match was definitive, then the man we had rescued from a survival raft was simultaneously in that raft and decomposing on the ocean floor. I called the trooper in Kodiak who had handled the investigation. I went through the timeline with him point by point, slowly, the way you work through a mechanical problem when you are trying to locate the specific place where the system fails. He listened. He did not interrupt. When I finished, there was a silence on the line, and then he said something that I wrote down immediately after hanging up and have kept in the drawer of my nightstand ever since. He said, "Mr. Halvorsen, we have the rescue report you filed in June. We have the body recovery report from August. We have a confirmed identification. What we don't have is an explanation for how both of those things can be true simultaneously." A pause. "That doesn't mean only one of them is true." I said, "What does it mean?" He said, "It means we're keeping both files open." I asked him whether anyone else had reported similar incidents in those waters. Whether there were other cases that resembled this one in structure, if not in detail. Another pause. Longer this time. The kind of pause that functions as a partial answer. He said, "I can't discuss other active cases." He wished me well and ended the call. I fished the rest of that season in the way that you do things when the foundation has shifted and you have not yet decided how to walk on the new surface, carefully, with attention to each step, aware that what held yesterday may not hold today. I did my work. I ran the gear. I pulled halibut from the water and packed them in ice and ran them back to Kodiak and ate my meals and slept my hours. But the water looked different to me. Not visually different, the color was the same, the movement was the same, the light on the surface behaved as it had always behaved. It looked different in the way that a room looks different after you learn that something happened in it. The information changes the perception. You can't unknow what you know. What I know is this: Peter Coyle, 51 years old, from Kenai, Alaska, died in the waters south of Kodiak Island in late June of 2016. The ocean confirmed this through the patient, thorough process by which it confirms everything, and forensic dentistry confirmed it through the patient, thorough process by which it confirms things. He was dead. He was in the water. He had been in the water, decomposing, for 6 to 8 weeks when we pulled him out in August. And in June, before he was dead, he was lying on my deck in the gray morning light, looking up at me with eyes that held no surprise, saying my name in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. Saying all three of it. The middle name my mother chose for our father, which I have never used and never liked and never shared with strangers. I don't know what he was telling me. I have spent years trying to decide whether he was telling me something or whether the thing he was doing was more fundamental than telling, whether he was simply acknowledging something, the way you acknowledge a thing you already know is coming. The way you acknowledge, perhaps, the person who will be the last face you see before the water takes you. Before whatever happens after the water takes you. I left commercial fishing in 2019. I live in Anchorage now, on the third floor of a building with a view of the Chugach Mountains, and I work maintenance for a property management company, which means I fix things in buildings where other people live and I never have to be more than 20 minutes from a road. I don't fish recreationally. I don't own a boat. I don't go to the harbor and look at the water the way some ex-fishermen do, the ones who left something behind that they keep coming back to look for. I don't go to the harbor because I am afraid of what I might see. Not the water. Not the boats. Not even another body rising through the green-black dark to break the surface. I'm afraid I'll see him again. Standing at the end of a dock, or sitting in a truck in the parking lot, or walking on the shore path in the early morning light. 51 years old. Outdoor gear. Looking at me the way he looked at me on the deck of the Marguerite and, without surprise, without confusion, with that terrible, patient recognition. And I'm afraid of what it will mean if I do. Because if Peter Coyle, who died in June of 2016, could appear on a survival raft 12 miles from shore and speak my name before his body surfaced in August, if the timeline of a man's death can fold back on itself in that water, in that cold, in that specific corridor of the North Pacific between Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula, then the rules I was raised with, the cause and effect and repair manuals and car catalogs, the rational architecture I had built my life inside of, are not rules at all. They are the story I told myself because I had never been far enough from shore to know better. And some nights, lying in my apartment in Anchorage with the mountains dark against the darker sky and the city making its ordinary human sounds below me, I think about the last thing he said. Not my name. After my name. In the very last minutes before we reached the Kodiak Harbor, when I was checking on him one final time and thought he was asleep. He wasn't asleep. He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling and he said, very softly, something I heard completely and understood immediately and have never told anyone until now. He said, "It's almost time." I did not know what he meant. 4 months later, my father died unexpectedly in Everett, Washington. Heart attack. No prior history. He was 58 years old. I don't know if that's what Peter Coyle meant. I don't know if I want to know. The water keeps its secrets. The cases stay open. And somewhere south of Kodiak, in the cold and the dark and the deep, the ocean continues its patient, comprehensive work, taking everything that falls into it, keeping what it wants, and returning the rest on its own schedule, in its own time, in whatever form it chooses. I check the locks every night, the same as any man. But I face away from the window. I have since June of 2016.